our third little section here about the Exodus and the Promised Land, moving up to the time of the Exodus, which there's two main camps within biblical scholars as to dating the Exodus, either in the 15th or the 13th century. And I'm not particularly going to go into that because it takes me a little beyond my expertise as an amateur historian trained in philosophy rather than this subject. I'm just a well-read amateur. But the era of Moses, if we take sort of 13th century Exodus, let's put Moses around about 1260 BC-ish, we're looking. And again, here are a few books, particularly good on this area are these books. James Hoffmeyer, who's an Egyptologist, has written quite a few books about the Exodus. He supports a 13th century Exodus, as does Colin Humphreys, and his book on the miracles of the Exodus. Some very interesting research in all of those. And of course, geographically, here we are moving down now to Egypt. Dawkins mounts this sort of argument from silence. He says, you would think that such a big event as the enslavement of an entire nation and its mass migration generations later would have left traces in the archaeological record and in the written histories of Egypt. Unfortunately, there is no evidence of either kind. No evidence of anything like a Jewish captivity in Egypt. It probably never happened, although the legend is burned deep into Jewish culture. That would raise a big question of why a culture would make up a legend about its culture coming from roots as a bunch of slaves in another culture. No other culture made up such a story. So, Thomas Davis is an archaeologist, unlike Dawkins, and he disagrees with Dawkins on this. He says no direct evidence has yet been uncovered to ground the Exodus in historical physical space, but this absence of evidence is often interpreted as a direct challenge to the historicity of the biblical account. However, he says, the formation processes that affect archaeological data in remote desert environments such as the Sinai, and the nature of the archaeological signature of a migratory group force a reassessment of this negative conclusion. He says, finding direct evidence of a single-use campsite of a nomadic people group that can be dated in isolation in the Sinai is a totally unrealistic expectation, and therefore it is not a surprising absence of evidence from which one can mount an argument. Kenneth Kitchen reports that a tiny fraction of reports from the East Nile Delta occur in papyri recovered from the desert near Memphis. Otherwise, the entirety of Egypt's administrative records of all periods in the Delta are lost. We just don't have Egyptian records. And monumental texts are also almost nil. And anyway, as pharaohs never monumentalized defeats on temple walls, for example, no record of the successful exit of a large bunch of foreign slaves with loss of full chariot squadron would ever have been memorialized in temples in the Delta or anywhere else. So again, since we lack a lot of Egyptian material that may have included reference to this, or in case of the temples and so on, probably wouldn't have anyway, but since we lack those records, it's very difficult to mount, again, an argument from silence as being at all significant here. Kitchen reckons that to explain what we have in our Hebrew documents, we would need to kind of invent a Hebrew leader who had experience of life at Egyptian court, given what's in those texts. It says, including knowledge of the treaty type documents and their format that we see, as we see in other cultures that we see in the Exodus and so on, as well as traditional Semitic legal and social usage. In other words, if we didn't know about Moses, we'd have to invent someone distressingly like Moses to make any sense of the situation that we have. This is the Brooklyn papyrus, dated from the 18th century BC. The Bible says that Israelites became numerous and spread across Egypt when they were there. And while all the documents from the Nile Delta have rotted away because of the Nile floods that covered the area annually for thousands of years, we do have this Brooklyn papyrus slave list from the south that has dozens of slave names on it, including biblical forms of names. I'm probably going to mangle these, but names like Shirapah, the same name as the Hebrew midwife in the Exodus account, Asher, and Ishkar. So we have sort of Hebrew Semitic names in this slave list from ancient Egypt. And famously, the tomb of Vizier Rekhmire from 1450 BC shows Semitic and Nubian slaves employed in making bricks, just as Exodus talks about the Semites being employed in brick making in Exodus 1 and Exodus 5. So we know from Egyptian sources that there were people of Semitic origin in Egypt who were slaves. We do know that. There's linguistic evidence as well. James Hoffmeyer and others who I mentioned here have documented various cultural and linguistic links between late Bronze Age Egypt and the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, that they think point to the authenticity of these stories. So Noonan says that given the observation that at least some of the Egyptian loan words in the Exodus and wilderness narratives were borrowed during the late Bronze Age, it's likely that the events of these narratives took place during the late Bronze Age, just as one would expect if they represent authentic history. So talking about loan words from Egyptian words coming into the Hebrew. Edwin Umarchi notes that the similarity of the Mosaic covenant to the Hittite treaties that we have, which date from the 2nd millennium BC, has convinced many scholars of the antiquity of the Mosaic covenant. Again, getting these details about how did people write covenants in that culture in a way that people writing hundreds and hundreds of years later in a different culture probably wouldn't have got right, but which the biblical text does get right, which again points to its authenticity. More getting the culture right, cultural verisimilitude. Scott Hann and Curtis Mitch, in their commentary on Exodus, notes that it displays an accurate knowledge of local conditions that are described in the story, such as the Egyptian agricultural calendar, the use of acacia wood, which is indigenous to parts of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, but which is not found in Palestine. So getting that there's a certain sort of wood that grows here but not here, the kind of detail that people who are just writing historical fiction without accurate sources tend to get wrong, but which people who are writing on the ground tend to get right. They argue it's difficult to believe that the authors in post-exilic Palestine could have known and accurately portrayed the conditions of 2nd millennium Egypt's agricultural calendar and the trees and so on and so forth. Stephen Moshier and James Hoffmeyer again have used information from geology and archaeology and digital topology and satellite imagery to produce a map of the Eastern Nile Delta and Sinai Peninsula during the Bronze Age. And they find that the restored geography of their Bronze Age map correlates plausibly with the Exodus text. They say they provide a plausible map of the region that's described in the Exodus text. And that's something that Hoffmeyer goes into in his books in some detail, and it's very interesting detail and worth looking at if this is something that interests you. the sort of geography of the Exodus. Here is the Merneptah Stele, looking at the sort of other bookend of the Exodus story. The Merneptah Stele, an inscribed stone, dates from about 1220 BC, 1220 BC. It's an extra biblical record that mentions a people group called Israel. And it was set up by the pharaoh Merneptah to commemorate military victories in Canaan. And it proclaims, among many other things, it proclaims that Ashkelon is carried off and Giza is captured, Hinnom is made into non-existence, Israel is wasted, his seed is not. In typical ancient Near East hyperbole, of course, Israel was not destroyed, and so on, but here is a mention of Israel. It's interesting to note that Hinnom, followed by an Egyptian hieroglyph that designates a town, so this town of Hinnom is made into non-existence, Israel, and that's followed by a hieroglyph that means a people, so that the people of Israel is wasted, his seed is not. So there's a mention of the existence of a people group in Canaan called Israel by 1220 BC at the latest. So if you have Semitic slaves in Egypt and you have Israel as a people group in Canaan, possible that the one got to the other, came to the other from the former, as it were. And as that archaeologists are noted, it's not too surprising that we don't have any direct evidence, or certainly no commonly agreed on direct evidence of that migratory group in the meantime. Also, recently there's been much discussion about the so-called Israel Berlin statue pedestal relief. This is some hieroglyphs on the sort of pedestal of a statue dating from the 14th to 13th century BC. There's a debate around the pronunciation of the one of the words that has to be reconstructed because of the damage to the relief. And one school of thought argues that the presence of a particular sound invalidates the possibility of reading this hieroglyph as representing Israel. But there's another group of scholars who argue that there's no known location the name could refer to at the time other than Israel. If Israel is the correct reading of this hieroglyph, these hieroglyphs, the spelling of Ashkelon and the proximity of the names Ashkelon and Canaan and Israel all together in this list are again reminiscent of that 13th century Merneptah Stele. However, the rendering of the name Canaan is more similar to its spelling in the early 14th century BC. Now, one might argue that that's because the guy who carved these hieroglyphs only knew the ancient form or was copying an older statue to crib off, or that this is an argument pointing towards the earlier of the two Exodus dates discussed by scholars. It's intriguing, but unfortunately it seems to not be a knockdown argument in either direction, as it were. But it is another piece of evidence for the existence of Israel in the 14th to 13th century time period. In 2017, so this is quite recently, excavations at, let's try this, Khirbet al-Masra, a 2.5 acre site in the Jordan Valley, 6 miles north of Jericho, revealed stone enclosures, rectangular rooms, and pottery dating to the late Bronze Age to Iron Age 1 period. The site appears to have been used by a nomadic or semi-nomadic group at the very beginning of the Iron Age, around 1200 BC. Now, if you take that 13th century Exodus theory, this may tie in. So Ariel University archaeologist David Ben Shlomo says, we have not proved that these camps are from the period of the early Israelites, but it is possible. If they are, this might fit the biblical story of the Israelites coming from east of the Jordan River, then crossing the Jordan and entering into the hill country of Israel later. This might be early signs of Israel coming into the land from the direction that the Bible mentions. So one to keep your eye on. And one last little thing here is quite interesting. We read in, for example, in Exodus 29:12, take some of the blood of the bull and put it on the horns of the altar with your finger. And this phrase about the horns of the altar repeats in various biblical passages in Exodus and Leviticus and in Psalms as well. Well, we know culturally that horns were a symbol of strength or superhuman power, and that persons accused of murder could hold on to the horns of an altar for sanctuary. This is mentioned in Exodus 21:14. And in 1 Kings 1:50, Adoniah feared Solomon, so he rose and went and took hold of the horns of the altar. Likewise, Amos 3:14 talks about the horns of the altar being cut off and shall fall to the ground. Amos was saying there's no refuge for Israel. Well, here, some nice archaeology to illustrate this. Horned altars discovered at Beersheba in southern Israel, and some very small horned altars in the picture next to that. But literally, these altars had these sort of corner horns of the altar. So that illustrates these phrases from this early time period.